It's a strange phenomenon, how someone can seem so sure of themselves, so composed, so confidently distant, and yet that very confidence is quietly propped up by the presence of someone they believe will never leave. You were that presence. You were the anchor beneath the surface. And because you were always there, always checking in, always responding, always making sure she felt seen and valued, she started to build a version of herself around that security. Not openly, not even consciously, but it happened. And when you finally withdrew into silence, when you stopped reaching out and let the air grow still, something underneath that confidence began to shift. There's a difference between genuine independence and the illusion of emotional strength that rests on someone else's constancy. That illusion often grows unnoticed. She might have walked with her head held high, thinking she didn't need your reassurance. She might have acted distant, dismissive even, as if your presence was optional. But deep down, she had woven her stability through the rhythm of your care. The simple fact that you were there, even when unacknowledged, gave her something to lean on. And like most things we take for granted, its value only becomes clear in its absence. That's what silence does. It removes the background noise we were too used to hearing. It takes away the invisible safety net and reveals just how high we were walking. When you go silent, you're not just removing yourself from the conversation. You're removing the foundation she didn't realize she built her self-adhesion on. Suddenly, she can't predict your reaction. She can't lean on your validation. She can't use your presence to hold up the facade. And that inner architecture starts to tremble. At first, she might double down. That's the common response. She tells herself it doesn't matter. She might even try to provoke you, hoping to force a reaction. But every unanswered message, every day that goes by without a word, starts to press against her internal sense of control. Because your silence isn't just quiet, it's powerful. It sends a message stronger than any argument could. It says, I will no longer be a silent participant in your avoidance. I will no longer fuel the illusion. And now she's left with herself. Not the version of herself that she presents to the world, but the one that comes out in private, when there's no one to impress, no one to manipulate, no one to lean on. That version starts to wonder, did I push too hard? Did I take him for granted? Did I mistake his presence for weakness? These aren't easy questions. They aren't kind, but they're real, and silence makes space for them to rise. Your silence challenges the idea that she had control all along. Because as long as you were the one reaching out, she could believe that you needed her more than she needed you. She could interpret her coldness as strength and your warmth as desperation. But now, with the dynamic flipped, that narrative begins to collapse. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in the quiet moments when she checks her phone and there's nothing. She wonders what you're thinking and realizes she no longer knows. That uncertainty is a seed, and over time it grows into something much heavier than she expected. People don't break because you shouted. They don't fall apart because you fought back. They crumble in silence. Because silence doesn't give them an enemy, it gives them a mirror. And that mirror reflects back all the ways they've avoided intimacy, all the opportunities they missed, all the sincerity they shrugged off like it meant nothing. Your silence holds up that mirror and it doesn't flinch and simply weighs. And what's more, your silence isn't angry. It's not fueled by spite. It's dignified. It's grounded. It's the kind of silence that says, I'm done performing. I'm done explaining. I'm done proving my worth to someone who chose not to see it. And that, more than anything, is what destabilizes her. Because now she has to ask herself why she needed your attention to feel okay. Why your distance feels so much heavier than she expected. Why your absence is louder than your presence ever was. And here's where it cuts the deepest. The longer you stay silent, the more she starts to realize that it wasn't your love that was weak, it was her ability to receive it. And there's no pretending once that realization sets in. No amount of bravado can protect her from it. Because deep down she knows you were steady, you were real, and now you're gone. Not in anger, but in resolve. Let her sit with that. Let her finally see the difference between the illusion she maintained and the reality she lost. Because in the end, silence doesn't just remove noise, it reveals truth. You see, emotional detachment is often misunderstood. People think that cutting off emotions, building walls, and distancing themselves is a sign of strength. But here's the problem. It only works when someone is still feeding the dynamic. It only feels powerful when there's another person trying to close the gap, when someone is still chasing, still hoping, still reaching out. The illusion of control depends entirely on the other person continuing to engage. And the moment that stops, the silence begins to dismantle everything. So when you go quiet, when you stop texting, stop checking in, stop reacting to the passive jabs or cold behavior, you're doing something that doesn't just feel unfamiliar to her, it destabilizes the very strategy she used to manage the relationship. Because the truth is, emotional detachment isn't sustainable in a vacuum. It's not some infinite source of resilience. It's a performance. And performances need an audience. Without someone there trying to break through, it loses all its meaning. There's a psychological mechanism at play here, and it's subtle but devastating. When someone leans into emotional detachment, they're telling themselves, I don't care. I'm above this. I've moved on. And maybe they believe that for a while. But deep inside, a part of them still expects that you'll come back, that you'll keep trying, that you'll prove how much you care by enduring their distance. That's how they keep score. That's how they maintain the illusion that they're stronger, because in their mind, your effort validates their indifference. But then it stops. You don't chase, you don't protest, you don't try to explain yourself, and now she's alone in her own emotional game. There's no one left to manipulate, no one left to withdraw from, and now the detachment isn't a tactic, it's a prison. Because it's one thing to pull away when you know someone's still waiting. It's another thing entirely to be alone and realize that the door you closed might not open again. First, she'll convince herself that it doesn't matter. She'll tell herself she prefers the space, that she needs to be away from you, that silence is her peace. But slowly, day by day, she'll begin to sense a shift. Not outside, but inside. Because the space she created isn't peaceful anymore, it's hollow. It's not empowering, it's isolating. And the longer you stay quiet, the more she's forced to sit with that reality. Emotional detachment, when it's used as a weapon, is a temporary illusion. It's not built to last. It only has strength when someone else keeps giving it meaning. And your silence is what breaks that loop. You don't have to say anything. You don't need to plead or explain. Just your absence, calm, dignified, intentional, is enough to shake the foundation. And here's the part that hurts her the most. She realizes you were never as emotionally dependent as she thought, that you were giving, not clinging, that your care wasn't desperation, it was loyalty, that when you stayed through the cold spells, it wasn't because you couldn't leave, it's because you chose not to, until now. That realization doesn't come in one wave. It trickles in, piece by piece, in the quiet moments when she checks her phone and there's nothing, when she expects to see your name pop up and it doesn't, when she opens a message draft and doesn't send it. And the silence isn't just yours anymore. It becomes hers too, except now it's not chosen, it's imposed. And that's when emotional detachment collapses. Not because you forced it to, but because the energy that sustained it is gone. She starts to think, to reflect. Maybe for the first time, she really begins to consider what it meant to have someone who is consistent, who is emotionally present, who gave without asking for repayment. And that thought lingers, it grows, because now she has to admit something deeply uncomfortable. Maybe she didn't push you away because she was strong, but because she was afraid. Afraid of being seen, afraid of being known, afraid of needing someone. And now, left with nothing but her own silence, she can't escape that truth. That's the cost of detachment. It works until it doesn't. Until the person it was aimed at stops responding. Until the silence becomes louder than any words. Until she realizes that the distance she created wasn't just a wall to protect herself. It was a cliff. And she's standing on the edge. So let her feel it. Let the silence stretch. Let it strip away the illusions and force the reality to the surface. Because in the end, the longer you stay silent, the more she begins to hear the truth she's been running from all along. There's something uniquely unsettling about silence that challenges the very foundation of emotional control. For so long, she might have believed that she held the reins of the emotional dynamic. After all, she controlled the distance, the pace, the narrative. At least, that's how it seemed to her. She could push you away, test your loyalty, see how much you would bend, and if she didn't want to engage, she could withdraw. That was her power. The ability to control when you were close and when you were distant. The emotional landscape to her was something she could manage, manipulate, and most importantly, avoid when it became too overwhelming. But then you stopped responding. You withdrew not in anger, but in quiet resolve. You chose peace over chaos, and in doing so, you didn't just create distance, you disrupted the narrative. You broke the script that she had been writing. For the first time, she wasn't able to dictate the flow of emotions. Your silence, in all its camp, wasn't a form of punishment. It wasn't a deliberate attempt to cause harm. It wasn't a gesture of anger. It was simply your boundary, a line that said, I will not engage in this toxic cycle any longer. And that's what disrupts her emotional control. Because silence isn't something she can manipulate. Silence is neutral. It doesn't carry anger or resentment. It doesn't demand a response. And it doesn't provide any ground for emotional drama. It's simply there, hanging in the air like a still pond. And for someone who is used to stirring the waters with their behavior, whether that be through emotional manipulation, withdrawal, or subtle tests, this stillness forces them to confront something far more uncomfortable than anything you could have said. When you're silent, she's left in the unknown, and that uncertainty eats away at the foundation of her control. She doesn't know where she stands with you anymore. The narratives she built in her mind about the dynamic no longer apply. She can no longer pretend that everything is fine, because now the tension is real. There's no fight to win, no distance to close with a well-timed message or a playful gesture. She's left to face herself, and that's something she hasn't had to do in a long time. What silence does is expose the raw truth of the situation. And that truth doesn't always align with the image she's built. She's forced to acknowledge that her control was never really about power. It was about avoidance. Avoidance of intimacy, of connection, of true vulnerability. She's been holding on to an illusion that she could pull away whenever it suited her, that her emotional distance would protect her from the fear of losing herself or being hurt. But the silence you've introduced shows her how much she relied on you to keep the cycle of avoidance going. So the deeper she sits with this realization, the more difficult it becomes to deny. When she thought she could control the emotional dynamic, she never considered what would happen if you stopped playing the game. What would happen if you didn't chase? What would happen if you stopped trying to break through the wall? The answer is painful. She would have to face the emotional chaos she's been avoiding. She would have to confront the reality that beneath her controlled exterior, there's a fear she hasn't allowed herself to examine. What's most unsettling is that she now has to reckon with the fact that your absence isn't something she can fix with a text, a smile, or a well-timed attempt to draw you back in. The silence doesn't offer an opening for negotiation. It simply sits there, unyielding, offering no space for her to regain control. It's a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. And as she begins to feel the weight of it, that's when the cracks start to show. This facade of emotional control she's worked so hard to maintain begins to erode. Without your engagement, she can no longer avoid the deeper truths that have been simmering beneath the surface. And that, above all, is what shakes her. What silence does, what your absence creates, is an emotional reset. It's as though the clock has stopped ticking and she can no longer measure the passage of time by how long it's been since you last reached out. She's left in a state of suspended animation, forced to confront her own insecurity. Without the constant reassurance of your presence, she is left wondering, what does he really think of me? What do I really mean to him? What happens if I don't fix this? And this isn't a small thing. It isn't just about the relationship. It's about her own sense of self. Because somewhere along the way, she may have begun to define herself by the control she could exert over you and the way she could manipulate the emotional landscape. But now that you've stopped reacting, she's left alone with herself and with the consequences of her choices. The silence reveals that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong about herself. Maybe she wasn't as strong as she thought. Maybe her detachment wasn't a form of empowerment. It was a form of avoidance. In the end, your silence doesn't just disrupt her control. It reorients her entire emotional reality. It makes her question everything. It forces her to ask herself what she truly values and whether the walls she built around herself were ever necessary in the first place. The longer you stay silent, the more that question lingers. And eventually it becomes a question she can't avoid. What would it take for me to be emotionally vulnerable again? The silence you create isn't just an absence, it's a mirror. It's a reflection of something much deeper than just not speaking or not engaging. It forces her to see herself as she is, without the distractions, the games, or the manipulation that often obscure the truth. And the longer this silence persists, the harder it becomes to ignore. The hardest part, the part that cuts deep, is the realization that it's not you who has been testing the waters. It's her. She has been holding herself back, avoiding emotional depth, and perhaps avoiding love in its truest sense. And your silence makes all of that impossible to deny. We are all driven by the need to feel in control of our lives, of our emotions. Control is safety. If we can control how others react, how they feel about us, we can keep things comfortable, predictable. But when the silence enters the equation, it introduces something wild, something outside her control. The absence of you is not something she can fix with a smile, a text, or a casual comment. It's an uncomfortable, undeniable force that strips her of the power she thought she had. It's a stark reminder that we cannot control everything, especially when it comes to human emotion. As she sits with this realization, she can't help but wonder, what does it all mean? What does it mean when the one person who always seems so present, so willing to engage, has pulled away? What does it mean when there's nothing to manipulate anymore, nothing to provoke or challenge? It means she must confront her own vulnerability, the very thing she's tried so hard to avoid. She has to come to terms with the fact that for all her control, for all her emotional distance, she still craves connection. She still needs intimacy. She still needs to feel seen and heard. And in the absence of you, she's forced to look at that need without distraction, without excuse, and realize how much it hurts to be alone. What this silence reveals is an uncomfortable truth, that she may have been trying to protect herself, but in doing so, she may have been protecting herself from love, from the very thing she desired most. The emotional walls she built, the distance she maintained, they weren't just about protecting herself from you, they were about protecting herself from herself. Because love, real love, asks us to be vulnerable. It asks us to expose our hearts, to allow someone else to see the parts of us that we keep hidden. And that kind of exposure is terrifying. It's much easier to control things from a distance, to keep people at arm's length so they don't get too close. Because getting too close means the possibility of hurt. And hurt is something she's been avoiding, perhaps for a long time. But the silence doesn't allow for avoidance. It doesn't give her the space to keep pretending. It forces her to confront her fear head on. And that's where the power lies. It's in the confrontation with her own limitations. It's in the realization that perhaps she's been running from something she needs, something she's been denying herself because it seemed too risky, too vulnerable. The silence makes her question everything. It forces her to consider the things she's been too scared to admit. What's even more powerful is that your silence doesn't just impact her emotionally, it impacts her mentally. It's like a weight that starts to settle in her mind. The longer she goes without hearing from you, the more her thoughts begin to spiral. What did I do wrong? Why won't he reach out? What's changed? Does he not care anymore? Did I push him away? These are the questions that begin to flood her mind, questions that she can't answer without addressing the deeper issues within herself. She starts to realize that the control she had over the relationship wasn't real control. It was just a shield, a way to keep herself from feeling too much. And without you there, without the ability to keep the emotional distance, she's left standing in the middle of her own insecurity, questioning her own actions, her own choices. The longer she goes without you, the more she has to reckon with herself, and that reckoning isn't easy. It's not something that can be dismissed or avoided. It sits there like a shadow, growing larger the longer she waits. The truth is, when you stop engaging, when you stop responding to her attempts at emotional manipulation or withdrawal, you give her the opportunity to face the one thing she's been running from, herself. She has to look at the ways she has held herself back, the ways she has used emotional distance as a defense mechanism, and the ways she has avoided real intimacy. It's in this silence that the walls start to crumble. It's in this silence that she has no choice but to confront the truth of who she really is without the comfort of distraction. And as she begins to face herself, something else happens. She begins to realize how much she has taken for granted, how much she has relied on you to be the emotional anchor, how much she has depended on your responses, your affection, your attention. And now, with nothing but silence, she's forced to reckon with her own emotional needs, her own fears, and her own desires. In the end, the silence isn't just about you removing yourself from the equation. It's about her coming to terms with her own vulnerabilities, her own fears, and her own capacity for love. It's about her understanding that emotional detachment is not a shield, but a prison. And when that realization hits, when she understands the cost of her own emotional distance, that's when the real transformation begins. The silence that you've introduced, the space between you and her, has a profound effect that's hard to ignore. It's not just that she's left alone to navigate her emotions. It's the fact that silence in this context becomes a catalyst for deep introspection. At first, she may try to fill the void with justifications, rationalizations, or distractions. Maybe she tells herself it's not that important, or he'll come around eventually. She might even convince herself that this distance is a sign of weakness on your part, that somehow it's you who's failing to engage, who's retreating into some form of cowardice. But the longer the silence persists, the more that narrative becomes harder to sustain. Eventually, the truth begins to seep through the cracks of her defenses. Your absence isn't a reflection of weakness. It's a reflection of strength. It's a refusal to engage in unhealthy cycles. A statement that says, I will no longer participate in a dynamic that serves neither of us. You are showing her through your silence that you are willing to stand alone, willing to let her face the reality of the situation without you there to soften the blow. This is the point where the shift begins to take place. Initially, she might feel anger, frustration, even resentment. After all, for so long, she has been accustomed to the idea that control lies in maintaining the upper hand, in keeping you in a place where you're always reaching for her, always seeking her validation. But now, that dynamic is shaken. The longer you remain silent, the more that cycle unravels. It's a slow burn, but it's undeniably real. She begins to realize that the control she thought she had was never truly hers to begin with. It was an illusion, a series of manipulations, games, and emotional distractions that masked her deeper fears, her insecurities, and her vulnerabilities. And so, she's left with nothing to do but look inward. The silence doesn't just create space. It creates an undeniable reflection of her own emotional state. Without the constant reassurance, without the external validation of your engagement, she has no choice but to confront what has been hidden beneath the surface for so long. This is the moment where she has to reckon with herself. What does she truly want? And what does she need from you? And more importantly, what is it that she's been avoiding by keeping herself at a distance for so long? At first, this introspection is difficult. She may try to brush it off, to pretend that it's all fine, that you'll return eventually and things will go back to normal. But the silence doesn't allow for that comfort. It forces her to feel the depth of the emotional gap between the two of you. And that feeling is uncomfortable. It's raw. It's the kind of thing that makes her question everything she thought she knew about herself. All the carefully constructed walls she built around her emotions begin to feel fragile. And she starts to realize that those walls weren't just protecting her from potential hurt. They were protecting her from something much deeper, the possibility of true connection. The longer you remain silent, the more she feels the weight of that realization. She starts to see the ways in which she has pushed you away, the ways in which she has kept you at arm's length, afraid of what might happen if she allowed herself to be truly vulnerable. But now, she is faced with the consequences of that. The absence of your engagement is no longer something she can ignore. It's not just about her missing your attention, it's about her missing the opportunity for emotional intimacy. The silence strips away the distractions and forces her to confront her own emotional limitation. And this is where the real shift begins. As much as she may resist it, the silence is teaching her something valuable. It's teaching her that emotional distance isn't a sign of strength, it's a sign of fear. It's a defense mechanism that keeps her from experiencing the very thing she desires most, connection. The longer you stay silent, the clearer it becomes that she can no longer keep running from her own emotional needs. She is left to face the stark reality that by keeping you at a distance, she's been depriving herself of something deeply fulfilling, something meaningful. But it's not just about her emotional needs, it's also about the way she has defined love, connection, relationships. For so long, she might have believed that love could exist without vulnerability, without the willingness to expose oneself fully. But your silence reveals the truth. Love requires vulnerability. It requires a willingness to be seen for who we truly are, without masks, without pretenses. And that's a scary thing to confront. It's scary because it means letting go of control of the walls we build around ourselves to keep from getting hurt. But the silence forces her to ask herself, is the safety of emotional distance worth the cost of true connection? Is it worth living a life where intimacy is constantly denied? This question isn't one she can easily answer. It's a question that requires her to dig deep into her own fears and insecurities, to confront the ways in which she has sabotaged her own happiness out of a fear of being hurt. And the longer the silence persists, the more that question looms larger. She can't ignore it, she can't deny it. It becomes a point of deep introspection, a place where she must examine her own role in the dynamic and take responsibility for the emotional choices she has made. The silence, in its quiet power, has a way of forcing us to face the things we would rather avoid. It exposes the cracks in our defenses and invites us to look at them, to understand them, and to eventually heal them. And when she looks at the silence you've created, she begins to see not just the distance between the two of you, but the distance between her true self and the self she's been hiding behind. The longer you stay silent, the more that truth becomes unavoidable. It's no longer about the silence itself, it's about what the silence has revealed. And in that revelation, the possibility of real change begins. The silence you've chosen to maintain is not just the absence of words or the lack of communication. It's a decision that sends a powerful message, one that resonates deeply. You see, when you choose silence over engagement, it is not a sign of apathy or indifference. On the contrary, it is an intentional and calculated act, a pause that forces the other person to reckon with their own actions and choices. It is not a power play, nor is it a manipulation. Instead, it is an invitation to reflect, an invitation for them to recognize something they may have been blind to, how their behavior has shaped the dynamics of the relationship. By withholding your presence in the conversation, you are not merely disappearing from the scene. Instead, you are allowing the absence to speak louder than any words ever could. The silence forces them to face the truth they may have been avoiding, the truth about how their actions have impacted you, how their indifference has created a distance that is now palpable and undeniable. It's like a mirror placed before them, showing them their reflection, the reflection they may not want to see. In the absence of your response, they are left with nothing but the reality they have created. What's important to understand here is that this silence doesn't make them weaker. It doesn't diminish their agency. Rather, it brings forth a power that is often overlooked. the power of self-reflection. Silence doesn't impose your will on them. It merely compels them to look within themselves, to see the consequences of their actions without your voice to soften the blow. In many ways, your absence serves as a catalyst for their emotional awakening, and that awakening is not a comfortable one. It stirs up questions that they can't easily dismiss. Why did they behave the way they did? What caused them to distance themselves? Why did they take your presence for granted? In this moment of silence, something profound happens. They are forced to confront themselves, and in doing so, they are forced to confront you, not through the lens of their emotions, but through the truth of the situation. This silence, although painful for them, offers an opportunity for growth. It is an opportunity for them to reassess the value of the relationship, to reassess what they've lost in the process of taking you for granted, and to realize what it takes to restore that connection. In a way, it brings them face to face with their own vulnerability, their own need for closeness, and their own capacity to open up and engage at a deeper level. But here's where it gets difficult for them, because once they come to this realization, they cannot simply undo it. They can't erase the absence you've created or undo the emotional space that now exists. The longer you remain silent, the more they realize the magnitude of what they've allowed to slip through their fingers. They can try to fill the void with distractions, with other people, or even with excuses, but none of that will truly resolve the underlying issue. The silence you've created is now a permanent part of the equation, and it is up to them to do the work of bridging that gap. As time goes on, this silence works like a pressure cooker, steadily building emotional tension that cannot be ignored. It begins to gnaw at them, piece by piece, until the weight of their own actions becomes too heavy to carry without addressing it. They start to feel the absence of your presence, not just emotionally, but in their day-to-day life. They may wonder if this is the beginning of the end, or if this is just the natural consequence of their own actions. And in this, they will begin to understand that the longer they go without engaging in meaningful dialogue with you, the more they lose their grip on the connection they once took for granted. The impact of your silence goes beyond just their emotional reaction. It forces them to reassess the relationship as a whole, to consider what it has meant for them, what they've invested in it, and what they've neglected. It's no longer a question of whether they'll reach out or not. It's a question of whether they have the courage to confront their own shortcomings, to acknowledge the ways in which they've hurt you, and to make the necessary changes to mend the relationship. The silence gives them no choice but to face this truth. Now, the challenge lies in whether they will act upon this newfound awareness or whether they will let the silence continue to unravel them. You've given them the space to reflect, but reflection without action is just wasted time. In this way, your silence is both a gift and a test, an opportunity for them to prove that they understand the gravity of what they've done, and an invitation for them to step up, to meet you where you are, and to rebuild what has been damaged. Silence is a powerful teacher, but only if they are willing to listen, if they are willing to take that painful step towards self-awareness and healing. Ultimately, the longer you stay silent, the more you strip away the excuses, the distractions, and the delusions that may have clouded their perception of the relationship. The silence forces them to acknowledge their role in the breakdown, to see how their actions have led them to this point. And as they sit with that knowledge, they will begin to see that it is not just your absence that is hurting them. It's the realization that they have failed to cherish something truly valuable. In the end, silence is not just a reaction. It's a response to a deeper need for authenticity, for vulnerability, and for true connection. By withholding your voice, you create the space necessary for them to face their own truths. And in doing so, you give them the opportunity to choose to continue down the path of avoidance and self-deception, or to embrace the discomfort of change, to step into the discomfort of growth, and to restore the connection that they have let slip away.